I can't squat because I've got disc problems in my lower back. Now this is interesting because I do hear this quite a lot. People basically start to avoid certain activities because they have back pain and disc issues and so on and so forth. But little do they know that most people that I see as a physio, and this is true across the board, who have disc problems, who have back problems, who have most problems, actually aren't that sporty. In fact, it's quite funny because when I used to work in the past in a particular gym, we didn't see many people from that gym. And people used to say, oh, it's great that you work in a gym, but actually not really, because that particular gym was more of a moderate trainer type gym. It was like a health club type gym. And that meant that people weren't pushing super heavy. They were working nice and moderately, but they were working hard. But this meant that they actually didn't get injured. They actually were in great nick. And I would see very few people from that gym. Nearly everyone we ever saw was an external person that was nothing to do with the gym. And in fact, invariably, they didn't do exercise. So it's interesting because obviously someone will go, well, ooh, I felt my back when I was doing the lift. But it could have already been there. We already know that if you look at MRI studies on lower backs, that we can see disc bulges and disc prolapses are prevalent in people with no pain whatsoever. So therefore, is it that the exercise causes the problem, or is the problem there anyway? And, is it the fault of the exercise? And if you are struggling with a movement or an activity or an exercise and you avoid it, you're not going to get any better at it. You're going to deteriorate away from it. And then obviously if you do it again in the future, it's more likely to give you pain and more likely to reinforce your thinking. But what does the evidence say on this? Does the evidence support, loading through the discs causes discs to deteriorate? Or is it the other way around? Or what is it that they found in the research on this subject? Now, there has been research done before which actually looked at astronauts. And what's interesting, astronauts have higher incidence of disc herniation, disc prolapses than people on Earth. And there's no gravity up there. And they found an incidence after they came back to Earth was higher as well. So they basically probably lost muscle. Their discs weren't used to taking load, so they got weaker, and therefore when they came to Earth, just their normal activities overloaded their disc and they got that problem. And that shows you, therefore, being unloaded actually creates weakness of the disc and weakness of the muscles, which then gives you more risk of having a disc problem. So that's what they saw in astronauts. And in the study we're going to look at today, it wasn't in astronauts, it was actually looking at other research instead. So in this case, they looked at a narrative review of the subject matter. Now, most of the studies they looked at were looking at cell, whole disc, or animal studies to look at disc. And some were looking at the intervertebral discs themselves in people who did exercise and didn't do exercise, looking at heights of discs and stuff like that. So what did they actually find? So they actually found that dynamic axial loading of the disc, which is like compressive vertical loading along the actual disc, actually seemed to help the disc and make the disc actually better, stronger, with greater height, and it actually was a adaptation of positive, certainly not of negative. They also found that slow to moderate loading of the disc was where this beneficial effect occurred. If it was excessively loaded and it was loaded fast, then this would actually be detrimental for the disc. They found that static loading, so long-term loading, just constant on the disc, wasn't good for it either. They found torsional loading, so like twisty kind of loading movements weren't so good for it either. Flexion with compression, so when people talk about, bending the back and putting a load through this. We mentioned rapid loading and high impact loading before. They found that was bad too. And explosive tasks. Now we've got to be careful with some of these detrimental ones, because this could be down to the person who they put this stuff to. They weren't trained for this stuff. They weren't prepared for this stuff. The thing is, the body is adaptable. So as long as the body has given the opportunity to adapt to a flexed position, to a faster loaded position, to a torsional load, it can adapt to these loads. So we have to be careful with some of this, because it does show that, yes, if you take somebody and then just start loading them in these ways, you're going to see some overload occur. But if you train them gradually into these loads and then load them, you may not see it the same. And therefore we have to be aware of that adaptability concept with the body as well. But certainly if you look at the first instance, is that moderate and low loads that are axial, that are dynamic, meaning that they're on and off and on and off, are actually beneficial for the disc, even in people who weren't used to this type of loading. And what we also found was lack of activity, lack of loading, lack of movement was detrimental to the disc. So if someone says, oh, I'm not going to exercise because I've got a disc problem, then actually they're going to cause more problems. So certainly when we look at lack of activity and avoiding movements and avoiding loads, that's not going to be good. Someone will say, oh, I don't load my back because I've got a bad back. No, this is a bad idea. Now it shows that if you're going to start the ball rolling, you want to start with dynamic, low and slow, moderate loads, rather than giant heavy loads. But that's just normal. You wouldn't do that anyway. No one will go to the gym and go, right, give me a giant weight, let's just load it really hard and fast. You'd be like, no, you wouldn't do that. So you would start that way, and this then shows this is actually good for the disc, contrary to popular belief. Now, if you look at the loading pattern on, say, a squat or a deadlift, because of gravity being in a certain direction, then it is actually dynamic loading, because as you're in a more vertical position, you're going to have a lot of axial load. And then as you go forward, your back will stay straight, of course, because you're not rounding it, so it's not flexion load. But you're going to then, obviously, the disc heights are going to increase because you're going to get a bit of shearing. And then obviously the compressive load will come back on again. So it's dynamic, which is helping to cause that flushing effect and that nutritional component of the discs. So therefore a squat and a deadlift would actually meet this bill for the healthy side of the disc. And as long as you start the loading steadily, then it's not a problem. And what is too heavy isn't the same for everybody. So if you've got Eddie Hall who did 500 kilogram deadlift, then obviously him doing 200 would be considered light, and his disc would be adapted to that. But if you gave me 200 kilograms, that would be very, very heavy and therefore probably detrimental to my disc. So it's again about whether you've prepared your body for it, and avoiding activity will unprepare your body for things, giving you more likelihood of issues. So the takeaway from this is actually load is good. Not all loads are created equal, but it also depends on how you approach these loads and how you build into them. So I would say, based on this evidence, and I say this anyway, is that gradually, within tolerance, building into loading for the spine, loading the joints, loading the disc, loading the muscles, loading the nervous system, getting the nervous system more tolerant is great for the back. It's functional movement of life. Squats and deadlifts are functional to life. And therefore, if you're not good at these activities, you're going to get exposed in your normal life. So it's really important to not avoid activities and not be scared of activities. This shows that you don't need to be scared of loading it. It just needs to be done appropriately and steadily and progressively. And you listen to your body at every step of the way. So if your symptoms kick off, you've gone too heavy, lighten it out and then build from there. This is the way that rehab works. But this shows you that no, loading, squatting, deadlifting isn't actually necessarily bad for your discs, and actually based on this, it may actually be good for them. So anyway, that's it for this video, and I'll see you next time.